In the second video on communications critical infrastructure, we're going to discuss cyber threats, cyber attacks, and mitigation strategies. This video was brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College. NCyTE Center in this material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation. Before you forget, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell for notifications. My name is Philip Kreger. I'm a professor of cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. We're first going to do a very quick review of the communications critical infrastructure sector, in particular how it relates to several other critical infrastructure sectors. We'll discuss cyber threats to the communications sector, as well as cyber attacks, and we'll discuss mitigation strategies for reducing the cyber threat landscape. And finally, we'll have a quick wrap-up. So as you recall that the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, has designated the communications sector as an integral component of the U.S. economy, underlying the operations of all businesses, public safety organizations, and government. And the communications sector is particularly critical because Presidential Policy Directive 25 identified the communications sector as critical because it provides an enabling function across all critical infrastructure sectors. Well, what does that mean? Well, we'll cover that in just a moment. Essentially, it means the communication systems are the backbone for information exchange, including voice, data, video, and all internet connectivity for all critical industry sectors within the United States. Studies have shown, however, for example, that the 11 telecom companies in the Fortune 1000 comprise the most vulnerable industry in the study, at greater risk than retail, banking, healthcare, and other industries. So even though the communications critical infrastructure serves as an important enabling function for all the other 16 critical infrastructures, it is unfortunately the most vulnerable to cyber attack. Telecommunication companies are a big target for cyber attacks because they build, control, and operate critical infrastructure that is widely used to communicate and store large amounts of sensitive data. And as we've discussed before, the communications sector is based around 5 industry segments, including broadcast, cable, satellite, wireless, and wireline, according to the General Accounting Office. Communications sector is more than just personal phone, messaging, cable, and streaming video, however, as we've discussed in regards to how it is used to facilitate all elements of the 15 critical infrastructure sectors. Additionally, the General Accounting Office reported that the communications sector depends on other critical infrastructure sectors and vice versa, in particular, the energy sector, the information technology sector, financial services, emergency services, and the transportation system sectors. And in fact, the damage, disruption, or destruction to any of these sectors could severely impact the operations of the communication sectors and vice versa. But we have a growing threat to communications, and this is really built upon the fact that the Internet of Things is growing rapidly. So what are the Internet of Things? Also, we've discussed in the last video and actually several other videos, there's things like cell phones, smart assistants like Alexa or Google Home, smart thermostats that are connected to the internet and then can be controlled by your smartphone while you're away from home. Security cameras, which can also be controlled from your smartphone from your way from home, but that means you have to be connected to the internet. And also smart appliances, things like smart refrigerators, smart washing machines, smart microwaves. Every time one of these devices is added to the internet, it becomes a potential attack vector. I can't impress upon you the importance of the communications sector for the safety and health of our nation. Our economies and entire business infrastructures are built on modern telecommunications. They have become such an intrinsic part of our lives that we take their constancy for granted, like water or food, fundamental and readily available. This ubiquity combined with a reliance on them make telecoms a major target for cyber criminals. Now that we've done a quick review of the previous video, let's look at cyber threats and cyber attacks on the communications infrastructure sector. According to a 2018 study, the telecommunications sector is one of the worst at tackling cyber threats. For example, in 2018, 43% of telecom organizations were victimized by Dns Based Malware, and 81% took 3 days or more to apply a critical security patch. As we've discussed in previous videos, is that no software or hardware is perfect. Every piece of software and hardware has various vulnerabilities, but they're not always identified up front, which means that on occasion, critical security patches have to be released by the companies that build the software and the hardware. And we've also discussed the critical importance of applying these patches as soon as possible. And that's why we've discussed previously that you should have on your own home computers automatic updates set to occur. Let's look back at that last sentence, which talks about the DNS based malware. For those of you who are unaware of what DNS is, let's take a quick look at how that works. So DNS is the domain name system. And essentially what it is, it's kind of like a telephone book between our web URLs and the actual IP addresses of the computers of those URLs. For example, as you see on the screen when you type in apple.com into your browser, is you hit enter, and then that will take you to Apple's website. But there's something going on behind the scenes that you might not be aware of. For instance, what really happens when you type apple.com into your web browser, the computer actually needs the IP address of that Apple server in order to connect to it. Well, how does it do that? Well, in your computer, you have set up some IP addresses, and this DNS server, again, is like a telephone book that connects those domain names like apple.com with an IP address. So when you type in apple.com into your browser, it connects to this DNS server and it asks, what's the IP address of apple.com? The DNS server looks up that connection between apple.com and its IP address, and it returns with the IP address of apple.com. And then the computer uses that returned IP address to connect to apple.com. So what is DNS malware or DNS type attacks? Well, let me just show you a quick one that's kind of general. Say you want to visit apple.com, your browser connects to your DNS server and asks what the IP address. Well, there's various ways of malicious actors that allow them to change the IP addresses on the DNS server so that it returns an incorrect DNS address, which means that after that, you're not connecting to apple.com, but you're connecting to another IP address, which may be a website that looks like apple.com. So in recent years, cyber attacks on telecom companies have grown in frequency and sophistication, creating a significant threat to the critical infrastructure. One of the most common types of direct cyber attacks is through something called the DDoS, which stands for Distributed Denial of Service Attack. A 2016 report found that the telecommunications sector faces this type of attack more than any other industry, almost twice that of the sector in second place, which is the financial services sector. So I know we've discussed what a DDoS attack is previously, but let's just quickly review what type of attack that is. So essentially, you have a victim up in the left-hand corner and you have the attacker down on the right. The attacker has been able to take control of various connected devices on the internet. And a lot of these are these Internet of Things devices, a lot of security cameras or appliances, or really just anything that's a chip that's connected to the internet. So the bad actor can control anywhere from thousands, let's say 10,000 to hundreds of thousands of Internet Things devices. And this is how these devices are then controlled and used to attack a particular victim. So the attacker sends out a command and control message that provides an IP address of the victim. The IoT devices then will send out a barrage of network packets overwhelming the victim so that the victim is unable to respond to any valid connections, which essentially shuts down that website. DDoS attacks are attacks on the availability of data, since the victim, once it is overwhelmed, is unable to respond to any types of requests. Recently, CISA published an alert that was based upon attacks for satellite communication network providers and customers. Just a few weeks ago, it was reported that there was modem wiping malware that caused a Viasat satellite, that's one of these SATCOM satellites, that caused broadband outage all over Europe. Tens of thousands of these satellite communications broadband modems were disabled in a cyber attack where they were wiped by malware with possible links to Russia's malware wiper program. So here's another term you might not have heard unless you've had a class or read something about cyber forensics. So what is a wiper program? Well, essentially a wiper program is one in which it will destroy a file so that it cannot be recovered. Whether you know it or not, when we normally delete programs on our computers, the deletion process doesn't remove the content of the file from the data storage device. And really, file systems are set up so that, for example, in this instance, we have a document called mydocument.pdf, and it kind of resides in the table of contents. So for all the files you have on your hard drive, there's a table of contents that has the name, the size, and the starting location of the file, the type of file it is, and various time and date stamps associated with it. So when you go and you delete that file, what happens is very little changes about the metadata of the file. For example, the name of the file, the time and date stamps, the starting location of the file, and all the other metadata associated with the file, and the contents. The only thing that happens is usually there's a small change in the metadata of the file, and then that linkage between that metadata and the file is no longer there. However, the metadata for the file, for the most part, as well as the contents of the file, still remain on the hard drive until that space needs to be used by a program, which means that the file is recoverable. So what does a wiper program do? Well, what a wiper program does, it actually goes through and will remove all of the contents of the metadata as well as the contents of the file. So essentially what it does is a wiper program will overwrite the contents of the file so it's unrecoverable, and will also do that for the metadata associated with the file, which means that the program needs to be reinstalled or the firmware needs to be reflashed, which means that of course that device has to be taken offline while those fixes are put in place. So in this instance, the threat actor used the management mechanism in a supply chain attack to push a wiper design for modems and routers. A wiper for this kind of device would overwrite key data in the modem's flash memory, rendering it inoperable and in need of reflashing or replacing. So what are the consequences of this attack? Well, on February 24th, 2020, as Russian troops invaded the Ukraine, Viasat terminals in Europe and Ukraine were suddenly and unexpectedly knocked offline and rendered inoperable. This caused, among other things, thousands of wind turbines in Germany to lose satellite internet connectivity that is needed for remote monitoring and control. So the lesson for this is an attack on one critical infrastructure can affect another critical infrastructure. And even in this case, a cyber attack affected a physical system, these wind turbines. Another cyber attack involved Telnex, which is a voice over IP provider, and they were hit again with a distributed denial of service attack. So Telnex is a voice over internet protocol company that provides worldwide telephony services over the internet, including in the Americas, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asian Pacific countries, and Australia regions. So that's pretty much everywhere. They were targeted with distributed denial of service attacks causing worldwide outages. And in another case, in March 2015, internet traffic for 167 British telecom customers, including the contractor responsible for the United Kingdom's nuclear warhead program, was illegally diverted to servers in Ukraine and held there for 5 days. And again, this is one of those DNS attacks. As all businesses have internet pipes going in and out, targeting telecom companies can give criminals direct access to business as well as their data. Also recently, it was reported that Chinese hackers are targeting telecommunications companies. In this instance, a purported Chinese hacker group called Lightbasin managed to initially compromise one of the telecommunication companies by leveraging external DNS servers to connect directly to and from other compromised telecommunication companies' networks. CrowdStrike, which is an incident response company, identified evidence of at least 13 telecommunication companies across the world that were compromised by Lightbasin dating back to at least 2019. Now that we've seen a few of the recent cyber threats and cyber attacks on telecommunication companies, let's look at some possible mitigation strategies that can reduce the threat landscape for the communications infrastructure sector. Now this comes from CISA, and CISA and the FBI strongly encourage critical infrastructure organizations and other organizations that are either SATCOM network providers or customers to review and implement the following mitigations. And notice that while this does indicate SATCOM network providers, this really goes for any telecommunication companies. First, put in place additional monitoring at ingress and egress points to SATCOM equipment to look for anomalous traffic. This is just a fancy way of saying any network traffic leaving the network or entering the network should be looked at to identify if the traffic could be part of a cyber attack, for example, malware or DDoS types of attacks or anything like that. Use secure methods for authentication, including multi-factor authentication where possible, for all accounts used to access, manage, and or administer networks. And we've talked about authentication before, and authentication essentially means you're proving to the computer who you are, who you say you are. So usually that's with a username and password, but we also talked about using multi-factor authentication. For example, text messages to your individual personal phone so that you add another layer of security when you're authenticating to a system. Use and enforce strong, complex passwords. Review password policies to ensure they align with the latest NIST guidelines. We've also talked about password complexity and the importance of making sure that you use strong and complex passwords, and you also have access to those passwords. And we've talked about the use of a password manager for this, which is a piece of software you can install on your computer, and it can generate these strong and long and very complex passwords that you would never remember, but it's contained in a database that is highly encrypted, and you can gain access to those passwords, anywhere from tens to thousands of passwords, using this password manager. That's what I use to secure my passwords, by the way. Do not use default credentials or weak passwords. Realize that every system comes with a default credential. And one of the first things you're supposed to do as a system administrator or just as an individual is to change these default credentials. Because if you Googled default passwords for devices, you should try this. You will see on the internet that there are hundreds of pages that list all of the default credentials for these systems. And when people don't change the default credentials, that means that can be accessed by a threat actor who has access to those default credentials. Audit accounts and credentials. Remove terminated or unnecessary accounts. Change expired credentials. And again, this is just part of Cybersecurity 101. When someone no longer needs access to an account, that account should be removed as it's no longer necessary. And by having it there, it just provides another potential vector into the system. Enforce principle of least privileges through authorization policies. Now, if you're in a cybersecurity class, this is one of the first things you're going to learn in the first month. The principle of least privilege means that you should only be provided access to those systems and that information that is necessary to do your job. And that is enforced through access control mechanisms, which you've discussed in previous videos. Review trust relationships, including IT service providers. Threat actors are known to exploit trust relationships between the providers and their customers to gain access to customer networks and data. Now think about this, because the telecommunication companies, and in fact all critical infrastructure sectors, have a service provider. And one of the things that threat actors try to do is to find the weakest link in these connections. And so if they were able to intrude into a service provider, then the likelihood is they might have the opportunity to intrude into the satellite communication networks or telecommunications networks. Remove unnecessary trust relationships. And if a telecommunication company is working with a third-party provider and then they halt that relationship, then that trust between the two should be removed as it's unnecessary. Review contractual relationships with all service providers. Ensure contracts include appropriate provisions addressing security, such as those listed below, as we'll see, and these provisions are appropriately leveraged. And essentially what that means is that when you have these trust relationships with these other external providers, is that they too should have provisions for addressing cybersecurity issues. And again, that relates to the bullet up above. Customers of telecommunication companies should have appropriate monitoring of the service provider's presence, activities, and connections to the customer network. Various companies may have these trust relationships with third parties, but again, because there is this trust relationship, they need to make sure that these third parties are also implementing appropriate policies and procedures with respect to cybersecurity. Notification of confirmed or suspected security events and incidents occurring on the provider's infrastructure and administrative networks. If one company has a trust relationship with another company, if there's any type of security event, then that information should be relayed to all third-party trusted companies, so they are aware of the security event. Implement independent encryption across all communication links leased from or provided by your provider. We've already talked about encryption and the importance of that, either encryption for data at rest or encryption in moving data over networks. Any sensitive information that is being sent over a network should always be encrypted. Strengthen the security of operating systems, software, and firmware. So how do we do that? Ensure robust vulnerability management and patching practices are in place, and after testing, immediately patch known exploited vulnerabilities, including in CISA's living catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities. So if you are a cybersecurity student, I would suggest that you sign up for CISA's alert. Essentially, they look something like this. Cisco releases security updates for multiple products, and what they do is explain somewhat what the issues are, what Cisco products or what products in general, depending upon the advisory, and then they have various links below that show you where you can find more information about the updates and to update the firmware or hardware or software of the products. Monitor network logs for suspicious activity and unauthorized or unusual login attempts. Whether you know it or not, servers keep information about various activity on the server. For example, successful logins, unsuccessful logins, attempted connections from outside the network, and so on. It's important that network administrators actually look at these logs or have a software program that automatically parse these logs, and if suspicious activity is identified, alert the network administrator. But again, this is very time consuming, especially if you're doing this by hand. Network traffic should be baseline to determine what is normal network traffic and investigate deviations such as large spikes in traffic. And there's something called an anomaly-based intrusion detection system, which is perfect for this situation. What it does is it looks at the traffic over various times of the day or various days of the week, and then when it sees large spikes in traffic, it can alert the system administrator that something potentially anomalous is occurring. Create, maintain, and exercise a cyber incident response plan, resilience plan, and continuity of operations plan so that critical functions and operations can be kept running if technology are disrupted or need to be taken offline. And again, this is something that we learned early in our cybersecurity classes. We need to have a plan. We need to have policies in place that determine how to deal with cybersecurity, but also if something does go awry, that you have not only a written plan, but you should also have put into place practice and training for these types of incidents so that when this happens, is that you've already been exposed to what occurs in the plan so you're not trying to catch up at the last moment. So in summary, we did a quick review of the communications critical infrastructure, and in particular how this sector relates to all of the other critical infrastructure sectors and why it is so important, because it serves as the linchpin for all of the other critical infrastructure sectors. We discussed potential threats to the communications sector, as well as actual cyber attacks on the communications sectors, and we looked at three in particular. We looked at DNS based attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, as well as the use of wiper programs. And finally, we looked at mitigation strategies for reducing the cyber threat landscape. This video was brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College.